2 years ago, the Council convened its first colloquium as a conversation on what was then being termed the new golden age of philanthropy. We had Governor Kane and Matthew Bishop of the Financial Times right here. Well, the world has certainly changed in those short 2 intervening years. And today we come together with some exceptional thinkers and practitioners who are on the front lines of our social or civic sector. We've asked them to explore how foundations and nonprofits can ensure their long-term sustainability and effectiveness in order to effectively keep serving our communities. There were really 2 essays that drove the idea for this year's colloquium. The first was a marvelous monograph by our moderator, David Grant, president of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, exploring the ideas of sustainability in their broadest form. This annual report is available on the Dodge Foundation's website as well as the Council's, and I really encourage you to read it. The second was a report recently underwritten by the Irvine Foundation identifying 5 trends that will shape the social sector. Convergence, as the report is titled, was produced by La Piana Consulting, and its lead author, Heather Gowdy, is one of our guests today. Both of these documents reference the fragile nonprofit ecosystem that we all work within. They recognize the privileged and nurturing role that foundations can play. For all of us working in the social or civic sector in this new normal, we have to become, as the Convergence report suggests, futurists, not predicting the future, but rather being tuned into our changing environment, continually evaluating and adapting, as well as experimenting with new approaches. Foundations can play a vital role in this work by supporting efforts that will frame and deepen understanding of key issues, by fostering and informing the dialogue and debate, and by promoting new ways of thinking. Again, as Convergence suggests, and many of you know this firsthand, foundations at their best advance and accelerate the capacity of nonprofits to achieve their missions. So we come together today at a time when our entire civic sector is and will continue to be tested in ways that aren't even on our radar yet. We have very little choice in our need to change. We have to find new ways of thinking together and thoughtfully defining our work in order to compete and partner effectively. This is the backdrop for our conversation today. It is my pleasure to introduce Vaughn McCoy, CNJG's newest trustee and Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability for PSE&G, he'll introduce our panelists, and I'll also ask our panelists to come on up to the stage. So, Vaughn.
Thank you, Nana. I tell you, knock knock has come a long way since I was a kid. You know, when I was a kid, Shannon, it would be like, knock knock, who's there? Ain't you who? Ain't your mama, or something like that. You know, and to hear that rendition was just phenomenal. I'm happy to be here for a number of reasons, one of which is, you know, I could actually walk here from my house, so it was very easy for me to get here this morning. So I'm glad you happen to have it here this morning, Nina. Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of you for coming out this morning to the Spring Colloquium, and I'm happy to be part of this as the president of the PSEG Foundation, but also as a newest board member of the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers. And I know our company has had a long history, you know, with the council, and so I'm happy to continue to fulfill that role. And I think it's important for us to be here for a number of reasons, and 3 priorities in our foundation are the environment, education, and economic and community development. And I think the discussion that we're going to, you know, hear about today all talks about those things in ways that if we do them properly and leverage them the right way, we can all build sustainable communities. And I see a lot of grant makers here. I see a lot of grantees that we work with here. And so I think it's good for us to all hear the same message from some very well-respected people in the industry and in the business. I think the bios of all of the individuals here today are in your packet, so I won't, you know, read the bios, but I would like to introduce who they are. We have Heather Gowdy from La Piana Consulting, who is here, immediately to my left. We have Ben Hecht of Living Cities, who is here, sitting in the middle. And then we have Jeremy Nowak of the Reinvestment Fund, who are here. So let's give them a round of applause so far. And I think each one of these individuals has a firm grasp and understanding that we're going to learn about today about what it means to be socially responsible, socially investment, and also what it takes to build, great communities in the cities that we serve. And then the person who's going to moderate our discussion this morning is, I think, someone who is no stranger to all of us, particularly here in New Jersey, and I'm sure he's known around the world. And I happened to talk to David today, and today I think is probably one of his last official acts. And so today he told me was his last day as president and CEO of the foundation. And so he's here today, and this is a nice official going away. And, for David, I think, he has represented to all of us what it means to be the leading edge or cutting edge in corporate social responsibility and foundation work. And so, David, we want to say thank you once again for being a role model to all of us here in New Jersey. And I heard you talking about, packing up and moving to New Hampshire, was it? Vermont, okay, up north somewhere. So maybe we'll see you on the slopes of Killington, one day. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to David. David?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vaughn. Thank you, Nina. Welcome to New Jersey, our three panelists. I'm sure you interpreted Nina's opening remarks the way I did, which is that essentially the future of New Jersey, if not the nation, rests on the quality of the advice you're about to give the people in this room.
That's a lot.
So let's begin. The four of us decided rather than do speech after speech, we're just going to have a conversation. And certainly when Nina referred to Heather's report about the 5 trends, it sort of may have sparked in a number of you, 5 trends? What are they? Let's just start, get our bearings, and ask Heather to give us a quick description of those.
Sure. I am on. Good. Of the 5, the first thing that we looked at really was demographic shifts. So a lot of people think of those, particularly in terms of generational differences and generational shifts. There's a lot out there. It is also racial and cultural. We are fast becoming a minority-majority society, so that's going to have a big impact on expectations, norms, how work is done. Technology is probably the one people are most familiar with. Right off the top of your head, the one that can be most frightening. Technological advances, things are changing every day. Tons of new things out there. What should we pay attention to? What shouldn't we? What good can it do? A third is the blurring of boundaries between sectors. So nonprofit, corporate, foundation, all used to be somewhat, collaborating, working together, but it's way more than ever, and it is continuing that way. Rising interest in civic engagement, so people, younger generations, more interest in working with organizations in totally different and new ways. Older generations, the same thing. And then an increasing ability to use some of these other tools to work via networks. Networks are not new, but a lot of the tools we have to work in networks are new. And that is enabling organizations to use a much wider range of resources than they ever had before. Individuals, organizations, governments, that people didn't have access to before. So that's really what we focused on.
Thank you. So there are those 5, and I'm sure since the report's been out, you've had to speak about it a number of times. Have you? Would you modify the 5 at all?
Oh, we started with a much bigger list, actually, and it was hard to narrow it down. And we decided for the purposes of really trying to bring it together, come up with themes, we would narrow it to 5. But I think there's other important things. I think globalization doesn't necessarily affect every one of us. Some would say the local food kitchen doesn't worry about it as much, but I'd include that one in there as well.
Okay, thanks. So, Ben, what as far as the trends that you see in your work, and let's keep setting the stage here. What's your reaction?
So I totally agree on the trends. I think the question is how do they? Everybody has to figure out how they apply to their work. And I think those trends are going to be very different if you are providing services on the corner in a neighborhood, or if you're running the Boys and Girls Club of America. So I think you have to figure out what they are. But I do think that the one trend, I don't know where it fits in there, but the reality of the economic reality, I think, is one that's going to be with us for a while. And if you take the trends and what I think will be substantially less resources from everywhere where people get their resources, whether it's the government at any level, philanthropy, corporate, institutionally, or from individuals, I think that will maybe be the biggest short-term impact, or have the greatest impact, that if the sector doesn't figure out how they're going to manage that, will have the greatest negative result.
Right. And Jeremy, you were nodding when he brought up the financial context. You agreed?
Yeah, I think that the trends are well articulated. I would put it in at least in the short term, I would say that one of the trends will be a very slow growth and probably pretty unstable economy. And maybe we'll get into this later. And I think the meaning of that for us, I think I would just sort of note a couple things. You know, when I grew up, you could have relatively low skills and still have a family wage. And in part because you got a premium for being an American when you had low wages then. The meaning of globalization is that there's no more premium for being an American, that globalization represents a kind of equalization of wages to some extent for certain sectors. So this whole question for low-skilled people of what the capacity is to enter what we think of as the middle class is a very different question now, and has been for the last really 2 decades, than it had been for other times in our histories. So that would be number one. Number two, I'd say that we're becoming, in part because of globalization, we're becoming really used to rapid and disruptive change. And the disruptive change can be everything from one day the Soviet Union disappears to one day an asset bubble that we had built a whole ideology around disappears, and we found out that there was a lot less there than we understood to be there. And this happens really rapidly. And so I think that the public and the private and the civic have really got to build the tools to actually withstand this kind of disruptive change, which is, I think, a product in some ways of globalization.
Yeah. I was going to say, and there's a magnifier effect to all of that, in that our essential systems are archaic, obsolete, and the people who are in charge of them, which is basically all of us, don't want to accept what Jeremy just said. And so there's a friend of mine, Matt Miller, wrote this book, The Tyranny of Dead Ideas. I don't know if people have read that.
We're actually getting it as a gift today.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm like Oprah here.
You know.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not a Chevy whatever.
Your council of New Jersey grantmakers at work.
But the interesting thing about it, I don't necessarily agree with all of Matt's conclusions, but the idea is that there's not a critical mass of Americans who will accept the fact that that we don't have the premium anymore. And so whether it's our education system that was built, at the turn of the last century, or it's a workforce system that was basically built only because the public schools don't educate our children, the whole thing makes no sense. And so we don't have the adaptive capacity to respond to the trends or the crisis. Right. And we've abandoned government, and we still say, we don't have trust in them, yet we're counting on government to actually work.
Yeah, so this notion of obsolete systems, you tend to think of things like, governments and the bureaucracy and the like, but I think I'm hearing you say that our own organizations have some obsolete qualities. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's obsolescence, of course, is an issue that is a thing to be careful about in every sector, right? So it's easiest to look at in some ways, government and civic. It's very common in the private sector. The best business advice anyone ever gave to me is somebody is trying to put you out of business, so it may as well be you. And that is the sort of the premium business advice. So this issue of obsolescence, which is sort of easy to see in the government sector, right? Because you've got place-based public unions, you've got budgets from a particular way, and you've got political cultures which, in Philadelphia, the political culture, there's no new idea they would accept, right? It just goes on and on and on. And it doesn't matter in many cities whether all the context around there changes and therefore you become, there's a kind of a slow death that happens. The political culture holds on, and it happens all over the place. And it happens within, we see it within military institutions, it happens all over. It's true for civic groups, too. And for civil society, for nonprofits, the same thing happens, whereas they hold on to a set of systems. I mean, in some ways, civil society is, including people who are really change makers in the way they think of themselves, are remarkably conservative when it comes to running and thinking about organizations, when it comes to running and utilization of technology. It's not simply that they don't have adequate working capital. Yes, that's true. But they're also quite conservative. They take sort of on-the-shelf models. They're the last to adopt interesting new management systems. It's very common.
So both of you have mentioned government, and one of you mentioned corporations. I'm wondering, Heather, when you made that point about that sector boundaries are blurring, did you have a sense of in the other sectors? Is there a similar sort of conversation going on about trends and change and what they need to do?
Yeah, definitely. I think the business sector especially seems to be doing a lot. There's a lot out there about what trends, how are things affecting the work that we do, our clients, our market. It's focused very much on economics. How can we maximize profit? There's an attunement there. Government sector a little bit less so. I think there the struggle is sometimes to change the culture, the political culture, as rapidly. But those issues are just as important in the nonprofit sector. Culture is ingrained. The way we work, the way we see business as them, not us. I think business also sees the nonprofit sector largely as them, not us, and vice versa. But there's a lot more openness to, you don't have to be a nonprofit to do good, to accomplish this goal, to serve this way. And in fact, it can help our bottom line if we do that. So I think there's openness.
Are you guys seeing in your work, are you seeing this sector blurring?
To some extent. I mean, during a period of scarcity, which we've been in the last 24 months, everybody, heads for the hills, right? And when they head for the hills, they have to be remarkably cautious about what they do and how they manage. So I would say that there has been this movement in the last 10, 20 years, just as Heather described. But I'd say to some extent it is on hold, or if it is not on hold, it is being done on an emergency basis. A business looking for a market that wasn't there, a nonprofit trying to figure out how to redefine value. They're all good things. A government saying, is there a more efficient way to do it? Can I redefine the meaning of public in some way by having a more efficient system and therefore not being, as the government reform people of the 1980s used to talk about, not being the rower, not doing the thing, but just steering and being the guys that sort of define the strategy. So I think all of that's going on, but I think some of it is going on right now because there's a bit of a scarcity. There's a lot of scarcity and a bit of a panic about how to maintain existing value. This is a remarkable period of just preservation. Now, during a period of preservation, it doesn't mean that you can't identify you can't have significant innovation emerge from that, and great, interesting things can happen. But pretty much everybody's got one foot in preservation or working out the muck of the daily balance sheet and profit and loss statement, and one foot in trying to figure out what the future is going to look like and therefore how to position themselves. It's a very funny place to be.
Go ahead, Heather.
I was going to say, one thing that I think this is where some of the demographic shifts come in, because younger generations are used to totally different norms, expectations, ways of working and interacting with organizations and causes and other individuals. So while organizations may have one foot in preservation and one foot in cautiously looking ahead at the future, you've got a whole couple younger generations that are pushing upwards saying, why do I have to be in the nonprofit sector if I want to do this? Or why can't I be an L3C, which is a hybrid organization, and get capital financing from traditional markets, but also get foundation funding and also do things in a different way? And so they're going to be pushing against that as well.
Ben, what did you want to say about that?
A couple things. One was, I think the one exception maybe to what Jeremy was saying is on the kind of clean and green technology sector. Because it's almost by definition a hybrid, double, triple bottom line. You're saving the planet, but you're also creating the next economy, and you're creating jobs and the like. So I think that there are many people in that sector who believe they're actually, by definition, by the work they're doing, blurring those lines. I think the other thing that Heather said about the upcoming generation, which I think is basically anybody under 35, thinking the people that are really comfortable with technology, doesn't include at least us. But it's folks that are very comfortable with technology. You know, they're always on what they call the digital natives versus the digital immigrants. Make a long story short, they actually have very little respect or connection to institutions. So they don't really care whether your nonprofit is there or not there, whether it's been there 30 years. In fact, if it is, they're skeptical about it. And they're basically, hey, you know, I go on my cell phone and or my smartphone, and I connect to 150 people who I know around the country, and those are the networks that I need. And I can go on the internet and get any answer to a question. I don't have to be humiliated walking into the door of some organization and some 24-year-old person, thinking they know more than me. And so that, I think, has the chance to completely transform. Well, it will transform. And so either people will be ready for it and change the way they deliver their products and services, or they won't be there to make that choice. And I think that really 10, 15 years, maybe 5, but in sometime relatively soon, we will begin to see that generation's, the impact of the way that they work having on at least the nonprofit sector, if not government.
Wow. So lots of there are nonprofit leaders in the room, and a lot of us in the foundation world have a lot of affection for nonprofits that have been around for a while. But it sounds like they're going to have fewer employees, full-time employees. It sounds like they may have they don't need as big offices. They may not, that they're going to be connected with different people in different ways.
They may have more employees. The question is, like Jeremy was saying, what's the value proposition of what they bring? Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite examples, someone Jeremy knows, is a group that is Consumer Credit Counseling Services of Atlanta. Suzanne Boas, who runs that. And Suzanne, she was a normal credit counseling organization in Atlanta, helping 50, 75 people a year. And then, unbelievably, she started asking her customers what they wanted. And what she found out was they actually didn't want the product she was providing. They wanted 24/7. They wanted it anonymous on the phone or on the internet. They wanted it in the language that they speak. And this last year, a year where you would expect credit counseling services to be in demand, they helped 1 million people, nobody face-to-face. And so she went from a storefront with 6 employees to hundreds of employees all over the country, various languages. But she figured out what the customer really wanted, and she changed her business model to meet the customer.
Could I just please? This is a terrific example. So I would flag, because part of what we're talking about here, part of the situationing of this conversation is philanthropy. And one of the difficulties of philanthropy is that it is one of the few sectors that has customers in the traditional sense. So whereas many nonprofits make the mistake of not asking their customers what they want, for the most part, philanthropies don't have customers. I mean, to be frank, if you don't take his money, I will, right? I mean, it's not like you're. So in that sense, it's actually fairly easy to be a B as a philanthropist, right? Being an A is actually quite hard, in fact, on the other way. But this question of philanthropy occupying a sphere without customers in that traditional sense, without getting actual customer feedback. I mean, forget these blind things that go out. Nobody cares about that. I mean, actual customers, would they want your product? Is your product useful? That is actually a very, very difficult, makes it really very difficult. And the second thing I would say, and this gets back to your example, this sort of networks example, these new people coming up, the issue isn't just what your customers want, but the issue is who are the customers that you don't have now that are actually going to redefine the world. I mean, the famous example of IBM was IBM did a terrific job of maintaining its best customers with mainframe computers. It did all the right things as a mainframe manager. It's just that, and it had all kinds of fancy reports telling them that everything is good by very, very well-paid consultants. It's just that Apple figured out there were these other customers, and thus the desktop, right? And this is really sort of an interesting question. So the question isn't just what do our customers want, but what's the universe of other customers we don't know about, and what kind of demand are they going to drive? And that is it's for different sectors, has all kinds of interesting implications.
That's very rich territory, particularly for this group. And let me actually ask all three of you. When you're talking about conservatism a little earlier, that foundations, of course, unlike the nonprofits that we serve, are not necessarily motivated to change because they're going to run out of money.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you had to sort of point to a foundation now that you know of where you'd go, now that's best practice right there. They kind of get it. They understand the way things are changing, and they're actually changing themselves in the right way. What would you say? You have one, Heather?
Yeah, I do, actually. We mentioned this in Convergence, actually. I love this example. The Blue Planet Run Foundation, which runs Pure Water Exchange. They fund water projects in developing countries. Clean water is their mission. And they had a lot of people in their organization from Silicon Valley, so they started brainstorming how can we bring some more innovative practices, and why aren't grantees and foundations normally learning more from failures and successes of others. So they set up an online network, and all of the grantees that they have in countries all over the world who get money for water projects agree to become part of an online community. They post their project. All projects are peer-reviewed. Everybody asks questions, challenges, provides suggestions. Then the group as a whole decides who gets funded and how much. And then the agreement when you get the money is you post everything. You are completely transparent. You post photos, you post successes, you post failures. You tell us what worked and didn't, and you tell us your lessons learned. And that's all online, so that every other water project that is funded can now learn from that.
So how old was that foundation?
Not very.
I'm just thinking that's pretty bold, to have the decision power lie out there instead of in the boardroom.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, the longer it's been in here, probably the harder it is to put it out there.
Well, they actually, just one more thing on them, they actually tried, in the last couple of years, they've been trying to get other foundations to come on board and share their network, and they have not had the kind of success that they were hoping they would have.
Come on, guys.
So, get out there.
Ben, what did you say?
So I think, one of my, I can't pick favorites because I have 15 foundations who are my bosses. But I'd like to highlight one. They're all really good and progressive.
Okay.
I want to highlight one, which is the Knight Foundation, and which is from Knight Ridder. The money comes from the Knight Ridder newspapers. They're based in Miami, and what they've decided to do. Well, so if you can imagine, if your money all came from newspapers, and you wake up one day and you look and you realize that there will probably be no newspapers. What are you going to do to make sure that there is some way for people to share information, be civically engaged, report on what's happening at the local level, the national level? And so knowing that they can't just go around and buy newspapers because there's really no business model to keep them alive, they've essentially looked around the country and said, well, there's some really interesting stuff happening with these kind of X-Prize ideas. So they do some X-Prize type stuff around civic engagement and that kind of stuff. And they'll say, well, we see that the FCC is about to engage in a new broadband policy, and there's all this broadband adoption. Let's put out an RFP, and whoever has the best idea of tying broadband adoption and broadband to civic engagement, we'll pick them. And they essentially use all the tools. And they do traditional grant making. You can apply. You can get accepted for various more traditional ideas. But they've essentially tried to adopt sort of state-of-the-art methods for finding the best ideas and supporting them.
So, and there's apparently a willingness to have some of them not work.
Exactly.
Yeah, and to pay attention what works, how we amplify the ones that work.
No, they by definition, the vast majority of what they do is high risk. And they're doing their best to choose, people will say, oh, it's a bad choice, it's a good choice, whatever. But they are trying to go to the very high risk, knowing that they're essentially making a sector. And so nobody has the answers, but the way they're going to get it is not quite 1,000 flowers, but quite a few of them.
Okay, so let's, Jeremy, I'd like to stick with the same question just because there are so many funders in the room. Do you see an example of what you would call best practice for funders?
Yeah, it's also a very young foundation. 10 years ago, little girl in my neighborhood who was dying of a rare childhood cancer called neuroblastoma started selling lemonade. And her name was Alex Scott. And Alex passed away. But each year before she passed away, she would sell lemonade. And it began, snowballed into something which I helped create as a foundation 5 years ago, along with her parents and others, into Alex's Lemonade Stand Foundation, which has raised now $35 million for rare cancers, childhood cancers, largely through the self-organizing networks of young kids and families all over the country who do lemonade stands. So innovation number one was we used the power of self-organization and networks, both in terms of word of mouth and relationships and technology and how we branded ourselves, to raise money and raise money dollar at a time, and had terrific success. And without going into where we give the money and how we give it, because that's also lots of innovation there, we continue to be this self-organizing foundation in the sense that we are now building an extraordinary database where we're getting parents who have children who either died or are still survivors of various kinds of pediatric cancers to put money into put information into the database about treatments and what happened, and we're going to create the first kind of longitudinal database with all of this kind of information. As you know, getting this information centralized is very difficult for lots of reasons. Again, it's the power of self-organization. So, I've always said to myself, there's a way in which money and information can be used to demobilize people, and there's a way in which money and information can be used to mobilize people, right, and to make them smarter. You can use money and information to make people dumber or smarter. There's lots of choices here in how you do it. And this is an example of making people smarter and creating more money and mobilizing them. And we're now, in fact, are mobilizing around a whole set of interesting public policy issues. That's a foundation. In that sense, it's actually one of the, in terms of the amount of money it gives away, it's actually becoming quite large in terms of just in terms of that. So it's an extraordinary example, but it is not. I can't imagine that happening from a traditional philanthropy in the way we do that. They would bring in first outside experts to spend a lot of money to do a convening of the possibility of maybe one day doing that database. And then they would bring in somebody with a very large consulting thing to do a prototype for that, McKinsey. And there would be, and in that process, they would speak to almost no parents, right? Mm-hmm. And we all know that, right? There'd be a couple they'd pull out because it would look bad. But I mean, so what you would have is you would have the sort of the process actually demobilizing the very constituency that you're trying to work with and share with. And so I know I sound a little pessimistic about the old system.
Okay, but so let's take that. You were painting a sort of an exciting picture. I'm wondering, what does your instinct or experience tell you about whether that's likely to come from a single foundation, maybe a young one, versus a collaboration? Because, in our field, when people talk about the future, that's one of the buzzwords. Say, well, they have to collaborate, and we say yes, and we do, and then we don't do it very well. Although, we have actually a world-famous collaboration called New Jersey Together. I'm sure you've all heard about it. Yeah. That the council has started. But what's your? You work for a collaboration.
Yeah, I am a collaborator.
You are a collaboration, and do you feel like you're on the innovative frontier?
I do, but I have I'm in charge, so and I was hired to do that.
So you're delusional.
Right. I lie and then I swear to it, or whatever the phrase is. But I do think so. But and I actually know a lot. I've learned a lot because I've been running this collaborative for the last 3 years, and I've learned a lot about what makes it work. And I think there is a huge opportunity. But number one is people have to come to the table and say we're not going to promote our parochial interests. Yeah. And that's really hard. But that's what really has to happen. Number two, they have to say we're going to pool our money and it's going to be a blind pool. So because what happens is everybody says, I'm coming in and I care about this, so my money's only going to that, and someone comes in, my money's going to that. And you basically have to say, we're going to pool the money in a blind pool, and we're going to have some way of making choices collectively where the whole of us is greater than the sum of our parts. Because if you're doing it individually, then you shouldn't be doing it collectively. Yeah. Can I add one thing, though, not about the collaborative, which is it's a local example, so I don't want to lose it, because I really think they've done an amazing job, which is at Robert Wood Johnson. A couple years ago, probably 10 now, maybe 12, they created I think when Riza was early in the job, she created this pioneer group within Robert Wood Johnson. I don't know if anybody from RWJ is here. Okay, and so essentially it's like a skunk works. This is my view, this is not Riza's words, but in my view, it's a skunk works. And they said, we're going to give you some money and you're going to innovate, but you don't have to worry about it tying to our program areas. It's about this, it's about obesity, it's about low-income people, whatever. Just find innovation in the healthcare space or health and healthcare space. And they've done amazing stuff. They started out a little slow. They weren't sure what it meant. But if you look at, and I've been one of their reviewers, they have a bunch of people from the outside who say, okay, so are we doing anything that's interesting? And they've done stuff from funding games, video games, to X Prize type stuff, to even funding through Ashoka, social entrepreneurs focusing on health and health care. So, that is a model that every funder could do, which is basically set up a skunk works and give the skunk works head full reign and say, they don't have to be approved by the board, because whatever that keeps innovation from happening within your organization, you have to take away from, 1% of your giving, 2%, whatever it is, something that you can live with.
It's a great example.
Yeah, if foundations could do that within themselves, but then also do that with their grantees. So this is one of the big challenges for nonprofits is in the for-profit sector, there's R&D money, there's a willingness you can set aside big chunks and then go give it to your R&D department and focus on being innovative. And there's a lot less in this economy. Yes, people are focused on survival and on direct service, but where is that money and time and space for a nonprofit to be innovative and come up with those things?
But the one issue on collaboration that I get nervous about, I'm okay with certain kinds of collaboration, but let me get back to that. So if you would have said, I've gotten to the point in the last 10 years, if I'm in a room and people talk about comprehensive something, I just leave, right? I leave. Because that means simply nothing will ever happen, right?
Or just a little bit in a lot of areas.
We want to take a comprehensive look at this, and I say, are you God? I have no idea what they're talking about. And then, so on collaboration, which, by the way, often they get everybody together to take a comprehensive look at something, which means we're going to have the lowest common denominator of the group in the room. Whereas collaboration, I'm a deal person, and I mean deal in the broadest sense. Collaboration, if you have I bring in others and collaborate, but around transactions, around something that you're trying to get done, not around an abstraction. And we have an awful lot going on in this country right now that is around the abstract narrative, that is around, you can see this in government all over the place. Everybody's got is there anybody that doesn't want green jobs right now, or it's like the new biotech, right? But the actual implementation of things, the actual doing of things, the actual, as I said in a talk last night, the actual sense of craft about doing something, and understanding that collaboration ought to be around the actual craft of implementation. That we've lost a sense of. That we don't have the habit of in the same way that we once did.
And it seems to fit with one of Heather's trends of networks, new networks coming together that
around
are
transactions.
around very specific goals and
That's right.
Concrete actions.
That's right.
Yeah.
I challenge that, though. I think it's true in part, but not enough.
Well, what gets in the way of it? It's a cool idea.
No, but I just think focusing on the transaction alone just is not enough.
So what it needs to be? It needs to be in the service of something?
So if you take your New Jersey together, I don't know what it is, but it's probably good.
It's brilliant. Unbelievably good.
But let's just say it's the equivalent of the David Grants from all over the state of New Jersey, right? If they all had a point of view about what had to happen in the state of New Jersey, and then actually said, this is our point of view, and we're going to use our authority and our influence and all of that to do that, which not only will make some policy changes or change people's views of stuff, but also give more space for the transaction. And I think you've got to do both. I think collaborating for the sense of collaboration is useless.
So I'm using transaction. I would agree with you, Ben.
At any level.
I'm using transaction in a broad sense, that it's got a
purpose.
A purpose.
Yeah.
It's purposeful.
It can be measured as
it can be measured as something. So transaction can be around intellectual capital.
Yeah.
Transaction can be all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I agree.
So this notion of measurement, the other word that you would just hear till you want to jump out the window is impact, and this idea of how you measure it. I mean, impact's a great thing, right? But we get so bogged down in this whole measuring dilemma where because we know that it's very hard to predict what's going to happen sometimes if you have high aspirations.
Yeah.
So I keep thinking, how is it that we create a system where you can actually get feedback and adjust and get enough people.
Key. That's key.
Yeah. Well,
it's
what have you seen? What have you
adjust.
seen out there that's working?
Well, did you,
Heather? You were. You sort of
The
gave a broad
successful
view.
organizations in that, we see a lot of transparency and a lot of openness and a lot of willing to have conversations rather than giving information.
Yeah.
So it's not about my work, what I'm doing, and let me tell you about what I'm doing. It's about, this is how I'm approaching a problem. These are the gaps I see. How are you approaching it? I think nonprofits need to look in both directions. It's not just about my organization. It's about my network with other organizations and with government and policy and advocacy. But it's also about how can I engage a network of individuals from around the world to help me do what I do. So maybe you don't have more employees, maybe you do, but maybe you have 5 times as many people working for your cause or your organization because you can get people from anywhere.
and here I'd say it's an attitude toward information and how you use it.
Yes.
And I'd say what's key is your notion of ongoing. So I think in the social sector, there has been a tendency to see impact and impact assessment as an ex post facto report card.
Yes.
I ran an empowerment zone. It didn't work. I suppose it worked somewhere. It didn't work. And I found out 5 years later. Well, who cares, right?
Right.
So the question really is, if I'm producing sneakers from Nike, what I want to know about information is I want information on an ongoing way to see whether I am increasing market share, to see whether I can increase productivity, to see what is happening with the sort of brand in different ways. Now, we're in the social sector, we're not trying to sell sneakers or trying to change lives. So it's much more difficult in that sense. But there's still this idea that, in fact, what we're trying to do is constantly use information and understand that production of any kind is iterative. It changes, it constantly, there's new context, and you're using information to do that. Now, the problem is that logic does not fit into the logic of the impact assessment. It simply doesn't. Now, there's a role for impact assessment, right? But it doesn't fit into that logic. And as I often tell people that we actually used to create a middle class without random assignment testing, you know, it was anyway. Is there anybody I haven't insulted yet?
No, you're doing a great job.
Heather's sitting there going, "No wonder why nobody funds him. It's crazy."
I see one of my colleagues in the second row who's. So just to push this one more bit here is that this that information flow has to be in a system, right?
Yes,
right? And that we frequently have this question of, well, how big is the conversation? How many people are receiving it, analyzing it, reacting, tweaking, whatever? Because if it gets too big, you're constantly talking to the people who just came in the room, right? If it's too small, then you're kind of people saying, well, who elected them to change my life?
Right.
It has to be useful for the purpose. You know, so I think that one of the best, I don't know how many of you book your travel online, but I literally don't stay at a hotel without looking at what everybody said about it in the last 60 days. I mean, it's just like, that's really simple, and you know, you can download for free that type of thing. You put it on your own website and try to get all your customers to do that. Scary thing. But that's one very small local. But then the other is that there's systems that for Cincinnati is one of my favorite examples, but basically what they said was, we're failing our kids. We're failing them from the time they're born to the time that they're supposed to have a job. 0 to 24, it all sucks. And it's not K to 12, that's bad. It's not 0 to 5, that's bad. It's not post-high school, that's bad too. And so what they said was, we need to say, what are the milestones, what are the achievements that kids are supposed to have all along the way? They came up with like 58 over 24 years. And they had the University of Cincinnati collect the data of how they're doing. So they said, we're here now. In 5 years, we need to be here. And every year, they issue a report card on all 58. And they say, this is where it's going up or down, and this is how fast we have to get there in 3 years. And it's sort of a civic accountability system that's based on the data collection and then the regular disclosure of it.
The question, though, is do you have the ability to make the changes, right? So if I'm in a uniform company, I can make the changes, right? And, in fact, shareholders will want me to make the changes if it's, say, the case of profitability. The difficulty there, because I've seen that, and it is brilliant the way they did it. The question is, do you have the political will? Can you use it as an organizing tool to do this kind of iterative logic and then make those changes over a period of time? And where you are doing very well, I mean, it turns out that we don't live in a meritocracy. So if you do something really well, like if you have charter schools, doing an extraordinary job, it isn't like we say, well, let them do it, right? In fact, we resist them and say, oh, my God, they're doing so well, right, from the system. Right. So the question is, how do you create the political will to use the information? And that's, I think, kind of where we are right now.
And it's not just that. What they're finding in Cincinnati is the biggest barrier to holding people accountable. So now they have 3 years of data. They see what's going up, what's going down, who is not doing their job along the way. And the biggest challenge to holding people accountable are the funders. Because Mary loves the YMCA, even though they're not getting the preschool results, and Jim loves, the after-school program in, for third grade.
Well, Jim's an idiot.
Sorry, Jim.
He has money.
But actually getting people to actually go use the data and say, we're now going to make our funding decisions based on this data, because who the heck cares that you have the data unless you're actually going to use it both on the public sector and the philanthropic sector.
Absolutely.
And that takes will, and it takes a culture change, and not all foundations can do
Right.
that.
So the culture change you're talking about, Heather, it seems like there's some various, it's like concentric circles, right? There's going to need to be some cultural change in the foundation world.
For sure.
But then this larger one where people are actually almost willing to participate in the system that has the data, that has decided we're going to do a few things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Talk more about foundations and how they may be unintentionally thwarting some of this change.
I think Jeremy start.
Yeah, sorry.
We all look so good compared to...
Yeah, you guys are... These are my moderate alternatives here. I would say that where they may be thwarting it is by funding. You were talking about innovation before and the necessity of having a separate world where you can innovate. So the question becomes, and the reason for that, I mean, if you read Christensen's work on innovation and many other people's work on innovation, it's clear that organizations, public, private, civic, they reproduce their own DNA. It's just simply what happens. And that may be fine for some kinds of things. But we decide that, in fact, something new, something other is going to happen out of that DNA. And it won't in most instances. Very rare, in fact. So what I think funders have to do is understand the limits of even the good things they fund, especially given where they think they want to go. That would be number one. And number two, they have to have a realistic alignment of the relationship between their resources and their vision, right? Because it's easy, foundations are forever, as you know, doing strategic planning, right? All of you, I know, are in the midst of a strategic planning process right now. And the question is, and you've got these huge mission statements, right? And you have assets, and some of you have relatively large assets, some of you have relatively smaller amounts of assets. But you've got these huge, I remember a foundation that I love to joke with about this, and I really like them. They're terrific people. I remember the Annie Casey Foundation. I remember they gave us, years and years and years ago, $500,000 a year, and we were supposed to, besides run some programs, we were supposed to change the workforce system in Pennsylvania, which has about $1 billion going through it, and it's a politically charged system. And they would look at us like, who are you?
They still talk about your failure on that.
They do. Yes. They do. They do, very prominently, right? And, you would just, you could imagine, like, you had all these, we would say, no, you're doing it the wrong way, and they would say, look, who cares? That's not there. So there's this question of having a realistic alignment between resources and mission, and realistically understanding what certain kinds of DNA can do and certain kinds of organizational DNA cannot do.
So let's keep going on this, Ben.
Yeah. So since I'm at my book club, I'll talk about another book that I love, and I actually think of them both at the same time.
You gotta go get this one for everybody now.
Yeah, and it's by Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. And he wrote a book, and if you're Jewish from New Jersey, you get it, which is Only the Paranoid Survive, which means I am. And basically what he said was essentially, it was like you had said, Jeremy. It's like he gets up every day. His theory was he got up every day assuming that he had to be paranoid because someone was going to come and clean his clock and build the next best chip or whatever it was. And basically when Intel was, they had all of a sudden all this competition, and essentially they were building the high-end chip. And everybody in the company said, we're going to own the high-end chip, much like the IBM computer. And basically he said, there's all these companies, AMD and others, coming and building the low-end chip. I'm never going to be able to build the low-end chip in my current structure. So he basically did a skunk works. And he said, I'm going to give these people, and if it turns out that the people building the cheap chip in Intel end up becoming the big part of the business and the high-end chip becomes a little part, so be it, at least we're in business. And they did, and they're still here today. Mm-hmm. And so I do think ultimately what you have to acknowledge is that your culture does not actually support the paranoia that you need to have. And so somehow you have to build in the paranoia, chief paranoia officer, or whatever the right title is. But I think you have to institutionally build in the fact that you don't actually know what's going on.
That's good. So there's a program for next year, Nina. You got it.
This is a group that's going to need scotch, I think, after this.
There's so much to talk to you guys about. I'd like to swing back to one of the trends, Heather, that you mentioned, the whole new technology business, because I'm guessing that every organization in this room, in one way or another, is trying to sort of figure it out. How is it working for people out there?
It varies a lot. I think one of the important things to remember is that when you try something, you're likely not going to succeed the first time. And so a lot of organizations who put their toe in to new technologies find it challenging. They find it overwhelming. How am I ever going to read all this, do all this, respond to all this? Why would I tweet about my day? That kind of thing. And some back down and don't do it, or stay with the blog that was updated last 6 months ago or something like that. But it's the ones that are willing to continually experiment and learn from their failures, go out, reach out to networks, take the networked approach to how can I learn to do this better, how can I use these tools better. Those are the ones that are going to succeed. And I was mentioning to you earlier, there's a great example, actually. Everyone's heard of the Red Cross and how with the earthquake in Haiti, they raised tons of money in the first week and after as well. They had actually done a very similar experiment just the week before on using a text, Red Cross to this number, we want to raise money for disaster relief, whatever, and it fell flat. And they did not raise nearly what they wanted. And they had tried it before that and before that. But they're an example of an organization that was willing to, they tried it, they learned from it, they knew what to do, they were ready, and then when the earthquake hit, they launched it, they tried it again, and it worked. And I think a lot of organizations have to be willing to go back at it.
We were talking earlier when we met each other that there's this tendency, that in the social sector, there's a tendency to think that there's this separation between something called program, the service I give, and something called infrastructure. It's kind of backstage, front stage, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, in business, if we think of infrastructure as finance, technology, HR, marketing, for example, they're front stage. They're the things that determine in an ongoing way how you shape, build, and deliver the product. Yeah. Whereas we have a tendency, and I think there's some philanthropy issues here. Everybody wants to fund program, right, and nobody understands that, in fact, innovation, change, efficiency, and productivity come from the integration of backstage and front stage in business. And so, in fact, all of those, how are you doing with technology? The problem is we think technology is this separate thing. Certainly we think that's true of marketing. Certainly, we think that's true of finance, which, I mean, everywhere finance is front stage, right, in business. So really, you know, where we think of we have programs, then a couple finance people, like little accounting things, right? That's not, in fact, the way anything works anywhere else. And that is a habit that we've got to change, both in terms of how we fund and in what we're going to do if we're going to have the kind of innovation that you're so interested in.
This whole notion of essentially general operating support to create infrastructure makes perfect sense. It occasionally bumps into this conversation that I know you guys hear all the time, which is where people say the whole field is just there are too many nonprofits to try to support.
Yeah, probably are.
When you, I mean, what's the trend there, or what's your? We're not supposed to use prediction, but I mean, we're talking about trying to create something 10, 15 years from now. Should we imagine fewer nonprofits? Yes?
For sure.
But how would we get there?
Well, you have to help them get there, but you won't. And this is.
I know. This is my last day on the job.
Yeah. So I'm using you as the poster person for giving.
That's fine.
And if you can fix it in the next 6 hours, David, it may be a late night. Your last night may be late. But I think the reality is that, and it's not just about metrics. So a few years ago, I started a nonprofit that was all about called One Economy, which was about getting technology, using technology to help people actually help themselves, low-income people help themselves get into information that they needed to be able to make the transaction that would help their life. Make a long story short, I had all these ideas. I went into Cisco Systems one time, and I said, this is what we want to do. And Cisco said, wow, that's a great idea, but just one thing. I said, what is that? They said, here's a piece of paper. Draw me a map of the ecosystem of all the players that have to play with you. And I understand what you're going to do, but what do they all have to do to make your idea work? And of course, my friend, I'm smiling. I'm going, oh my God, I have no idea. Absolutely, how am I going to delay this long enough? And the bottom line was, it was exactly the right question, and that's part of the question that philanthropy has to ask. Right? They have to say, number one, not what service are you doing and how good is it. That's not the question. The question is, what's the social problem we're trying to solve? What's the population level change we want to see happen?
That's right.
And then what's the ecosystem that has to be in place? And who are the anchor institutions that have to be in that ecosystem? And when you do that, and you say, well, you're not an anchor, and then you shouldn't support them. And if they are an anchor, then you should support them, and they shouldn't have to raise money for 5 years. I mean, the idea that Jeremy Nowak spends X percentage of his time raising money instead of using his brain, that part of his brain isn't being used to solve problems. It's being used to raise money, which is an unbelievable waste of a resource for our country. I'm serious.
And you see how effective I probably am raising money.
No, but my point is that is that for the extraordinary 0.5% of those in our sector who are truly brilliant, and we all know some of them, they shouldn't be spending a minute of their time raising funds. They are the anchors to the social change we need, and we should say, those are the anchors. We're making a bet. But it does require you to make some choices, meaning the funders make some choices, and it's really hard.
Because those are competing with the millions of other nonprofits who nobody wants to let them go out of business, even if they're not very effective, even if they're not part of an ecosystem or don't want to be part of an ecosystem. But there's this reluctance to let anyone go completely out of the picture.
So if you take your trend of blurring boundaries, which I agree, and your idea that let's just start from the perspective of what problem we want to solve, right? Social problem we want to solve. The question really isn't what's the role of a nonprofit or a for-profit. It's what problem are we trying to solve? We run a very successful financing program for supermarkets. We've done now over 80 supermarkets that we have financed in low-income places, both rural and urban. There is no nonprofit, there's very limited nonprofit relationship in any of it, and no philanthropic support for any of it. But there's now 500,000 people with access to high-quality fresh food at competitive prices. It was what problem are we trying to solve, and how do we get it solved?
Sector agnostic, I think.
Sector agnostic, I like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And related to that, I do think that we also have said we are going to do what I affectionately call the big-ass workaround of the public sector. And it's like we're not going to help the public sector actually have capacity that they need, because they do have to play certain roles, even if it's licensing and stuff like that. And so instead of saying, let's fund Jeremy to solve food deserts around the world, around the country, Jeremy can play an important role, but there clearly is a public sector role to that, which they did in Pennsylvania. They played the right role with you guys.
They gave me money.
Yeah, well, that's okay. That's the right role.
They gave me money and stayed out of my way.
But the problem is that we can't keep saying the nonprofit sector is going to work around. Here's a group that helps 40 people with their health care. Let's give them some more money. Now they're helping 400, and then we go, God, they're not that good. They're not helping 40 million.
Right.
And you're like, the reason they're not helping 40 million is because that's a public sector problem. And so I think the other part is not just in the public sector agnosticity, if that's a word, is to say we look at nonprofit solutions, we look at for-profit solutions, but we also have to help the public side to work.
So let me ask, Nina's going to come up in a minute and ask a couple questions too. I just want to, I'm interested, given what you all have described, which is, systems that we know, cling to, they're under a bit of stress now. Mm-hmm. You've painted a certain kind of a picture of a better system with the sectors interacting a bit differently, et cetera. What's your level of hope it's going to happen?
I'm pretty hopeful, but I think it's going to be hard. It's a huge cultural change on so many levels. For the individuals involved, for the organizations, for the sectors.
So what's the first thing that these folks sitting here could or should do?
I think it all comes back to leadership development, and not just at the top of an organization, but all the way through an organization. That it's people at every level, it's younger generations learning what they learn, it's focusing on things like mentoring, but two-way mentoring, two-dimensional mentoring. The younger people are mentoring the older generations and vice versa. It's getting a much more collegial, collaborative, networked approach to solving problems. I think that's going to be necessary.
Thanks. How about you guys? What a parting shot on that issue of hope?
So I'm very hopeful. I agree it's incredibly hard. But I do believe, and I agree with the leader thing, but maybe with a little bit of a different twist, which is I do believe ultimately it's about leadership. It's multi-sectoral leadership. And what we have to do is essentially find and support those leaders in those sectors who are willing to expend their political capital, and I mean with a small p, to work together in these new and different networked ways to take on these systems and to have the adaptive ability as political leaders change and as philanthropic leaders change. You have to have the ability to withstand that and not have to go back to the first step.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hopeful about certain things, including the irreverence of some of the demography, the sort of people you were talking about, as long as it can be channeled in the right way. I think it's going to take a long time to sort of run past these existing systems and conditions. So I think there's going to be a lot of pain over the next 5-10 years because of that. I think we'll ultimately come out okay, and I think we're going to because of this blurring of boundaries, we're going to look a lot different in 10 years from now than we could have ever imagined, and we're going to look at problem solving in a really different way. It's going to take adults, and one of the things we've lost here is you just put on cable TV. We just simply don't have adults. I mean, we just have people and you can see it from both ends of the spectrum. There's no orientation towards solving problems. Yeah, right. There's an orientation towards scoring points, and that's a very frightening predicament to be in.
So let me invite one of New Jersey's great adults to the podium, Nina Stack, to take us home.
Oh, David. Thank you. I continue to think this has been wonderful. And we want to open it up to some questions, too, with the audience. And I was going back to Jeremy in the beginning, talking about, you talked about expanding your client base and understanding who your customers are and reaching out more. And I was thinking about one of the phrases that I loved in Convergence, sort of built on the ideas that we need to collaborate, but we're also now in competition with the people that we need to partner with. And the word, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right, but co-opetition.
I don't know if it's real, but
Right, I know, but I like that. It was sort of, the cooperation, collaboration, and competition. And I'm wondering about any strategies that you may have seen that have helped to build trust among organizations that may have always just traditionally been competitors, but how they, what are ways to help build trust so that maybe they can work more effectively together?
What? Okay. I've seen some communities are starting to do more with these community-level meetings about what problem are we trying to solve. So what is it in our geographic area that's really stymieing all of us? Is it poverty? Is it job creation? Is it, and how can we all do something about it? So it's focusing large groups of people who don't normally work together on a bigger vision, and then together articulating where we want to go. And if you get them starting to work together and talk together, there's been some good results coming out of that.
In the Cincinnati model I was talking about, what was really fascinating was the superintendent of the schools didn't want to come to these meetings, these big meetings, because she was saying, everyone's going to say, it's your 50% dropout rate that's killing us. And the head of the University of Cincinnati said, with all due respect, I got a 50% dropout rate too. And that sort of completely changed the dialogue of the people sitting around the table. And it was sort of like, what? We all are flawed, and we're all part of the problem. And but it took Nancy Zimfer, Nancy. I mean, it took Nancy Zimfer to say that, who was the head of University of Cincinnati, now the head of the SUNY system. But that was it just completely changed the tone.
I think it's useful to remember that when markets work, and they often don't, they fail a lot, but when markets work well, and if you go burrow in, you see that there is a coexistence of competition and cooperation, and I think people don't recognize that. So on the one hand, people in a sector are competing for everything, customers, materials, workforce, all that. On the other hand, they've got common infrastructure needs. They've got common regulatory issues. So there's an incredible amount of cooperation that goes on, sometimes segment by segment within the sector. And so, in fact, the model, I think, of things that work well when they do is the model of both cooperation and competition. The question is, where does it play out? And in the playing out, can we recognize that to be human is to be both competitive and cooperative simultaneously? And once again, we can have a kind of a civil way of being within that context, and it's okay. Now, that is within that, there's a set of normative issues about how you play. And if there's anything that I think we have seen recently in the last couple of years, particularly in the finance world, is that because of misaligned incentives, it's one thing to be competitive, it's another thing to not play well. And that the role of society in part is to say, of course there's both cooperation and competition, but within a cultural boundary that's got a set of values. And I think there is where we've got to get back a hold. I don't know if I answered your question, but it seemed like the right.
Well, and I think within that you can see some strategies that both nonprofits can use and the foundations can use in doing that. But it's allowing us all to be a lot more human. And we've come off of such a time in our society where we've had to be so much better, and I think maybe that's starting to be much more human.
I also think there's something about somebody in the mix actually putting on the table, which Jeremy actually is really good at, which is sort of like challenging the orthodoxies. I mean, you don't get over big problems unless someone actually says the emperor has no clothes. And I think that everybody's so nice. In a way, you have the two extremes, right? You have the crazies on cable, and then you have everybody just being so nice. Right. And you actually don't solve the problem with either strategy.
Great.
Right.
Could we turn to the House lights?
Somebody once said that if CNN were now happening during Nazi Germany, they would have gone, Hitler, mad fanatic or misunderstood person? You decide. So I think there is this right.
Right. We have time for. Can we turn up the House lights a bit? We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Do we have any questions to see? Where do we begin? To see. Could we ask you to introduce yourself and your organization?
I don't know how it works. I mean, I think they ought to. I think that's a big lever of change. I think the question is, how do you get back to my idea of transactions? How do you fund at the interaction of experience of learning what works, of constituency building and policy at the same time? So I think there's richness in that. I mean, scalability is about policy change, and the value we have as practitioners is we've got the legitimacy of practice to bring to policy. So I would think you'd want to do that.
I think, and the folks we have here actually do, although there are funders who don't,
Right.
And for varying different reasons.
Yeah.
That's something.
I don't know if Jersey does more or less. I don't know.
Let's say, up in the top there.
Sydney Harbor,
Oh, Sydney.
Foundation of South Jersey. As a former engineer,